Good afternoon. I am Captain Kath Walker, and I am a chaplain at Belkin House in Vancouver. And we're a multi-program residential facility, but today I'll be talking about our community residential facility, where we provide housing for up to 30 federal offenders re-entering the community, and we accept high, medium, and low-risk offenders. Re-entry is a critical place, and spiritual care and pastoral care play a critical role in their successful re-entry. I have found that I like to use the HOPE assessment tool when I work with people. And so the HOPE assessment tool stands for, what are your sources of hope, strength? What do you draw on in difficult time? And then you ask, are you part of a faith community? Do you have a faith? Is it important to you? And then you ask them about their practices. What practices help them? And then ask, is there relevance to this situation? Is there something I can help you with here, or something you need to reconnect with God? And so it's sort of become my default tool I like to use with working with people. And so for our residents in our community residential facility, CRF, it's a major transition. And because we have people who have high risk and low risk, we have people who may be considered survivors, and we may have people who have been incarcerated for a shorter period of time. But there's some general things that they all have in common in this transition. And so I came across an article by Duncombe, and he spoke about the pastoral concerns he found in prison, and I think they relate to the concerns of people who would be in a CRF. And he spoke about the problem of shame and the problem of self-deception. He also spoke about the lack of vision or realistic life plans that people had in their life. He also spoke of the impact of shaky religious foundations or false teaching or understanding. And he also spoke about the lack or scarcity of pastoral presence and the lack of prophetic voice, or the lack of social responsibility in speaking into a concept of a gospel greater than ourselves that concerned more people. And he spoke about people lacking the opportunity for meaningful service. And I think all of these things are relevant to the people in our CRF because of restrictions on time. I'm really going to focus on addressing the issue of the problem of shame and self-deception, shaky religious foundations, and even the scarcity of pastoral presence. I also came across this article by Amar, Windsor, Aguilar, and Tube. It's actually part of a study they did on a restorative justice program. And they found that offenders have antisocial behavior, or behavior that really shows that they have a lack of moral motivation. And they found that when you help people increase their moral motivation, they're less likely to reoffend, they're less likely to use substances. And so they talked about how there is a need to increase empathy. There is a need to increase perspectives, or taking on perspectives of other people, helping people not only to forgive themselves and receive God's forgiveness, a forgiveness recognized based on what they really have and the impact it has on victims, but also become better at forgiving other people, and to increase their relationships and improve their relationships with other people. And these two articles really relate to the person I am using in the paper as my case study, and I don't want to say too much about them. But there's someone who really struggles to have empathy. They really struggle to take on the perspective of others. They really see that they're the victim, and they really struggle with this deception. What type of life is it to live with the restrictions that they have? And there's someone who has a number and will always have a number of restrictions on them because of their crime. And so I was sort of motivated to say, how do we help someone take on perspectives? How do we help someone receive forgiveness but recognize what they have done? And so I was sort of drawn to these articles to help address the spiritual needs of the person in my case study. And so in my research, I found a number of interventions to help address some of these pastoral concerns. And so one of them was this very general biblical teaching and preaching, but very specifically not to teach an individual salvation, more an invitation, inviting you into what God is doing in the world, which really does help with a sense of social responsibility and forgiveness, and it does link into social responsibility. But also having a sense and teaching of a biblical narrative helps people find meaning in something greater than themselves. It also helps them develop their worldview, and it also can be a place of developing virtues. The reading did recommend 12-step programs as a way to cut through self-deception, as well as mentioning pastoral counseling. And so one of the recommendations was narrative attachment therapy, though I'm not fully in agreement with that, because narrative therapy helps people tell their story, but it often puts the focus on outside forces instead of taking personal responsibility. And so other material that I found focus more on forgiveness and restorative justice teachings that help people take responsibility. So in this case, take responsibility for their crime and the impact it had on other people, and help them to actually fully receive forgiveness. And so they talked about helping people find acceptance in the tools that you use, and so active listening was a key component. Also using challenges to challenge some of the self-deception ways and journeying with people. And then one of the things that was mentioned numerous times was having positive social supports and having role models. And for me, I'm thinking about how can we integrate more Christian volunteers into programs to help with building up a support network for people in our CRF program. So in thinking about these interventions, I was thinking about what's some spiritual disciplines that could help someone. And so in the reading, I came across this posture of recognizing the suffering Christ in each person. And I think that's paramount in what we do. And it really helps people overcome shame. But I also was thinking, if people are to find a secure attachment with God, a practice like the breath prayer, Abba, I belong to you. Father, I belong to you, can help that attachment take root. And there's also spiritual practices of detachment or examen or forgiveness that I think are really important, and I'll touch a bit more on that in the next slide. So to conclude my presentation, I just wanted to share some resources, and they'll be listed in my summary. But I wanted to point out that the Spiritual Discipline Handbook is the book that I pulled a lot of the spiritual disciplines from that I just shared. I wanted to point out the book Restoring Peace is a restorative justice program that uses surrogate victims, and it really does. There was a study which is in the article by Amo that helps people grow in their moral motivation and increased empathy, and so I'll be looking into that. At our facility, we run Celebrate Recovery, which is a Christian-based 12-step program, which again was referred to in the literature, that really helps people, and they do things like take an inventory and make amends, and so it's really a discipleship program that's really helpful. And then the Kairos ministry I wanted to mention in the article by Rowan. He had been a volunteer for years, and so he shared some of the things they did on inactive prayer and forgiveness. And so if you have a chance to look at the article, but part of it was using rice paper and writing out who you forgive and having it dissolve in water. And so I'm interested in some of their ministries and how that engages people. And then I just included The Story and Believe, the books I read last year that I think could really help with people who have shaky foundations. And the premise behind Believe is it looks at what you think, act, and be, and saying what you think, what your doctrine is, and acts of practices of religion can really cultivate virtue in you. And then the story captures the grand narrative of scripture and talks about seeing where God is at work in the big picture and also in the individual lives. And I think these are key teachings and engagements that would be helpful for people in community and residential facilities.